extrovert said I'm Jennifer Gatewood. If you know me, you know that I'm a huge fan of horror movies. So as soon as I was ready to pick a topic, I knew I wanted to talk about the horror genre. And I knew I wanted to talk about it with a feminist lens, which brought me to the pretty obvious conclusion to talk about Final Girls. Even if you're unfamiliar with horror movies, you're probably familiar with the trope. The final girl is a lone survivor in a group of young people that have been getting picked off one by a gruesome killer. The term final girl, along with its original definition and characterization, comes from a book called Men, Women, and Chainsaws by Carol Clover. She has an opinion of final girls that is less than flattering. To Carol Clover, these characters are truly male characters that are put into young female bodies in order to be attractive. As a young girl growing up watching horror movies, I have a completely different perspective. These characters have been nothing but empowering and inspirational for me. And I don't believe that her characterization is reflective of what we believe as the true meaning of a final girl and what the audience perceives of their character as well. So, and therefore I'm calling for what the brilliant Dr. Christy Cook called a radical redefinition of the final girl. Now, I'm going to be challenging a lot of Carol Clover's findings, and it may come off as abrasive, but I want to preface that she is a brilliant author. She was one of the first and is still one of the most influential women to join the conversation around gender in the horror film. She revolutionized what we think about the implications of horror films. She advocates a lot for the feminist movement. She talks against misogynistic and predatory ways of storytelling and filming. She all around was a trailblazer in gender studies in the horror film, and she deserves a lot of respect. Now, that said, a lot of her values are very outdated, but that is to be expected. She was born July 21st, 1940, and growing up in the 40s and 50s, her experience is much different than mine. Therefore, so are our perspectives. Now, although I respect her and I think she's brilliant, I don't think that her values still stand now, and I don't believe that her understanding of the final girls needs to be the default. So before we get into what her definition is, I'd like to preface that the foundation on which a lot of her points stand is in fact quite faulty. The first reason for that is the assumptions that Clover makes when looking at her audience. Kind of the entirety of this book revolves around the question of why are young men watching these films that are so centered around the experiences of young women? What do they have at stake when they're watching a teenage girl defeat a killer? Is it a sadistic form of pleasure? Is it this just strange appeal to violence towards women? What's their reason for watching it? Now, that relies on the fact that she found in a survey that the majority of the audiences for horror movies consists of young men. Now, that's fine. That was, of course, the reality in that time. However, she makes a very quick assumption that because of that, that means that the audience consisted of straight young men. Now, I have the experience of going to a lot of horror conventions and events where I've surrounded myself with members of the horror community. And I know simply from that a lot of the demographic there consists of members of the LGBTQ+ community, especially gay men. The author of Homosexuality and the Horror Film Monsters in the Closet, Harry Benshaw, says in his book that horror stories and monster movies, perhaps more than any other genre, actively invoke queer readings because of their obvious metaphorical forms and narrative formats which disrupt the heterosexual status quo. Themes of otherness and monstrosity have been coupled with queerness ever since those conversations first started. So to disregard the existence of gay men and horror movie audiences is a very, very real oversight on Clover's part. And the assumption that straight men make up the entirety of this audience is the core of a lot of the decisions she makes when it comes to what final girls are and mean. So it's an important mistake to point out. On top of that, Carol Clover doesn't recognize the diversity of horror film audiences. When she talks about these young men, she compares them to those who watch action films like Dirty Harry. And studies have found that that's not exactly true. When compared to audiences of other genres, horror film audiences have been found to be 25% more likely to be African American and 15% more likely to be Hispanic. Already meaning that horror movie audiences consist of more marginalized groups than other genres. On top of that, even the Caucasian members of this audience tend to live outside and exist outside of the status quo. So even they exist kind of in their own marginalized group. And when you look at it in that way, it changes the question of how are these young men identifying with these young women, to the point of we're looking at members of marginalized communities identifying with a marginalized community member. Now, on top of that, her entire book also relies on very strict gender roles and outdated ideologies. Carol Clover follows a very Freudian mindset. She expresses that a lot of feelings, actions, characteristics are overtly female or male things to possess. I think that that's just something that we've grown out of in society. We're really taking strides to move past that way of thinking. And I don't think that that needs to be the way that we approach looking at a female or a male character. She goes so far as to question the true gender of a character based on the way that they behave. Further on that, Carol Clover says when talking about her ideas with sex and gender, sex proceeds from gender, not the other way around. A figure does not cry and cower because she is a woman. She is a woman because she cries and cowers. And a figure is not a psycho killer because he is a man. He is a man because he is a psycho killer. I don't know about you, but I think we can agree that that way of thinking and thought process is not super representative of the way we go about things now. So now we can go to her definition. Generally speaking, the 80s final girl that Carol Clover talks about is the female victim hero that exists within slasher movies. She is a virgin, she is sober, she doesn't drink, she doesn't cuss, she doesn't stay out past curfew, she doesn't dress provocatively. She is this perfect, modest, prude character. On top of that, she is smart, she is observant, she's the first that notices that something is going on. She's brave, she's independent, she faces death head on and all of the trauma that she faces and overcomes it. Now that's about as complimentary as Carol Clover gets. Carol Clover decides that the final girl is set apart from other girls. She says that the final girl is not fully feminine, not in any case feminine in the way of her friends. And this is why. Clover says that her smartness, gravity, competence in the mechanical and other practical matters, and her sexual reluctance set her apart from the other girls. To hammer that in, Carol Clover goes on to say, the gender of the final girl is likewise compromised from the outset by her masculine interest, by her inevitable sexual reluctance, and her apartness from other girls. Now, I completely disagree from this point that Clover makes. First of all, I think that the idea that being sexually reluctant would ally you with a teenage boy is a joke. Final girls are set apart from everyone in the film. She outsmarts her friends, her parents, the police, the military if they get involved, and most importantly, the killer. She's smarter than everyone. She's morally more just than anyone else in the film. There's no separation from the girls, there's separation from everyone else in the movie. Now here's my favorite part. Carol Clover focuses on the transformation that a final girl goes through in the 80s slasher formula. We will watch a final girl go through this very frightened, cowering state in the first half of the film as she watches her friends die, her parents show up, not do anything, the police officers get shot in the face, super fun. She's super scared. And then at a certain point she decides, enough is enough, I'm the only one left, I'm gonna kill him. And she goes through this very obvious transformation from flight to fight, from fearing to feared. Now, Carol Clover describes this transformation as the final girl being phallicized, that she takes on these phallic weapons, a chainsaw, a knife, and takes on this new male identity. Her femininity is gone. She is now a phallicized character who is able to be dominating and brave and strong. On top of that, to kind of support that, Clover talks about in movies and in general that angry displays of force belong to the male character. And ladies, you'll love this. That crying, cowering, screaming, fainting, trembling, and begging for mercy belong to the female character. Now, as I'm sure you can guess, I don't agree with that at all. I think that the process from being scared and frightened to taking your power back and fighting back can be explained through very simple mental processes, whether that's desensitization, self-actualization, whether that's just seeing your trauma and healing. I don't think she has to become a male character in order to become a strong one, or in order to face this killer head on. Now, going from that, clearly, Carol Clover talks this whole time, that she takes on male traits. She becomes this male character. That a final girl is simply this surrogate for the male adolescents in the audience so that they can identify with this character in a way because she behaves like they do, but she still gets to be hot and have boobs and they get to see her shirtless. It's a bit of an absurd thing to say. That the traits that the final girl takes on, that Carol Clover talks about being masculine, her smartness, her observance, her mechanical skills, are things that women are perfectly capable of. Women are just as able of taking on being able to be tactful, being able to take on a killer with weaponry, being able to be resourceful. Those are not things that are exclusive for men to be able to do. Women are all capable of that. There's nothing about the final girl's character, in my opinion, that would suggest that she can no longer be a woman. Now, on top of that, her perspective is entirely different from mine for another reason. I believe that final girls are not this strange surrogate, but instead a reflection of whatever is going on in the current gender conversations and feminist movement. And Clover even touches on that. She says on page 22, "The slasher film, not despite, but exactly because of its crudity, gives us a clear picture of current sexual attitudes." I think that we see that clearly in the final girls. And if you use that logic, it really begins to explain why the final girls look the way they do over time and why they might have been so well received. For example, when we're looking at the slasher films that Carol Clover looks at, which are from the 70s and 80s, we're looking at an America that was under Reagan's influence. There was this very serious Christianity boom. And so in suburban America, the ideal traits that a woman would have included sobriety, responsibility, modesty. We see that reflected in these final girls. Those might not be the characteristics that we think make a woman strong or powerful now, but that doesn't take away from the fact that at that time, these final girls were representing this perfect, powerful woman of suburban America in the 80s. On top of that, and when you're talking about how can these young men even accept that a young woman is the hero in this movie, they're not used to this. But when you look at those times, we were seeing the rise of the working women. Young men and boys were seeing their moms serve as the breadwinners of their family, sometimes with their father not even present. Slowly but surely, the 70s and 80s were a time that America was becoming more comfortable with a powerful woman. And that might be why young men were becoming more comfortable with seeing a strong female character. It might just be a reflection of those times. Now, therefore, with that said, as we develop as a society, as our conversations about feminism and gender continue to develop, so do our final girls, and we see that very clearly. So in order to find a characterization and a definition that accurately represents our modern final girls now, we need to look at modern depictions. Now, I've picked 3 movies for this. Each of them are a decade apart, with Scream coming a decade after the last movie, or the last film that Carol Clover talks about, which gives us a very clear progression that we can look at. The first film I'm going to talk about is Scream from 1996. Now, the first difference you'll see is the fact that there are 2 final girls in this movie. Now, mainly there's only one, and that's Sidney Prescott. She serves as a protagonist. We focus on her the whole time. But Gail Weathers, journalist and author, also serves as a final girl. She goes through trauma, faces death head on, helps save the day, yada, yada, yada. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar with this movie, I'm sure a lot of you are, a bunch of high school students get terrorized by a man in a mask named Ghostface, who ends up being 2 guys. That's not important for this project. What is important is what these characters look like. I'm going to start with Gail Weathers. Now, Gail Weathers, first of all, is an older woman. She is not an older working woman, nonetheless. She's not the 17-year-old senior in high school that we're used to seeing take on these masked killers. But on top of that, Gail Weathers is very assertive. She's aggressive, she's nosy, kind of schmarmy, and kind of rude throughout the entire film. She's not a super nice character. In fact, her kind of attitude would have probably earned her an axe in the face in a Friday the 13th movie. But in Scream, Gail lives, and she serves as one of the heroes as she shoots one of 2 Ghostface and kills them. But now I want to talk about Sidney Prescott, our main final girl. She's really got only one significant difference from the 80s girls, but it's very important, and that's the fact that Sidney, not to air her dirty laundry, but she's not a virgin. Now, that would, again, sex is a death sentence. One of the most iconic scenes from this movie is when a character, Randy, who's a huge scary movie film, explains to all of his friends the rules in order to survive a horror film. When he talks about how you can live through a slasher, he explains only virgins can do that. As he's saying that, Sydney is upstairs sleeping with her boyfriend, who she doesn't even know is the murderer. It's fine. And you sit there listening. If you have sex, you die. We switch to a scene of Sydney having sex. Obviously, Sydney's now going to die. But again, Scream is different. Sydney doesn't die. She takes on both Ghostface head on, saves her dad, saves everybody, and then, doesn't really become friends with Gail Weathers, but they save the day as this wonderful female pair. Now, Scream knew what it was doing. It's very aware of the formulas in 80s movies, and there's an intentional disruption of the formula. But it's a very clear step in a different direction when we're talking about the strong female characters in these movies. Now, the second film I want to talk about is It Follows. Our final girl in this movie is Jay Height. This movie is completely different from the 80s slasher films, very different from Scream. It is described as a reimagining of the slasher film and a revamping of the slasher film. It Follows came out in a very interesting time in our culture, especially as women. It came out after the Me Too movement was created, but kind of right before it really blew up in 2017 and people started talking about it. That sort of social climate very clearly has an influence on this movie. Now, you might not be as familiar with this one. In It Follows, we see Jay Height go on a date with this boy, and they sleep together. Right afterwards, he chloroforms her, ties her to a chair, and explains to her that through sleeping together, he has passed something on to her. Now, this thing that he's passed on to her is, no matter what you may think it is, it's an entity that begins following Jay. It takes the form of any person. It can take the form of strangers, someone you know. And only Jay can see it. Only the cursed can see it. Now, this entity is slow moving, but it never stops, and it will follow you until it finds you, and you are brutally murdered if it gets to you. The only way to save yourself and get this entity off your back is to pass it on to somebody else, which Jay does, twice in fact. We see Jay have sex 3 different times and pass a curse onto 2 different people, and she still lives, with unheard of type of situation. The characters all throughout this film are sexually active, and there's no shame in it. There's no trying to talk about there being anything morally wrong with what Jay does. It simply is what it is and is a way of her overcoming this monster. But what's more important about this film is the process that Jay goes throughout this movie. Now, as I'm sure you know, just from my synopsis, It Follows has very clear messages in its plot and in its film about sexually transmitted diseases, but more importantly about the lasting trauma of sexual assault. It deals with the issues of not being believed, of not having witnesses, of having this looming entity slowly creeping after you every day. And we see that influence on the way Jay behaves in the movie. There is no transformational switch from being scared and cowering to suddenly being powerful. In fact, if anything, Jay remains scared throughout the entire film. Jay faces a different form of this monster every day and stays in this slowly healing process. She faces it head on every day, slowly but surely trying to get better at it, still feeling exhausted and frightened. There is no requirement for Jay to get rid of any form of victimhood or forget anything that's happened to her in order for her to overcome this monster. She is allowed to remain a victim and to remain in the healing process, but still overpower it. On top of that, Jay, when overcoming this monster, is not on her own. Some of her friends die and get injured, but for the most part, she's a very involved support system because this isn't a monster Jay can fight on her own. We've seen in the past a final girl have a cop that comes in last minute, Gail Weathers who runs in and comes back from the dead. But we haven't seen a lot of movies where the final girl has an entire group of friends dedicated to trying to help her beat this. And all of that is very clearly influenced by what was going on. The last movie I want to talk about is Fear Street Part 2, 1978, that came out in 2021. Our final girl is Ziggy Berman. Now, Fear Street number 2 is like Scream in the fact that they knew what they were doing. At the start of this movie, the audience is informed that the young girl who survives this summer camp massacre will have the initials CB. Shortly after that, we are introduced to Ziggy Berman and her older sister, Cindy Berman. Now, Cindy Berman is a camp counselor, goody two-shoes. She doesn't cuss, She's morally very, very upright, especially compared to the other camp counselors. She's a grade A student. She dresses in cute little ironed polos. Perfect picture of what an 80s slasher final girl would have been. But, and the audience accepts that, and most people on their first time watching this movie expect Cindy Berman to be the final girl. Much to your surprise, at the very end, in the last fight, Ziggy ends up being resuscitated and is the final girl in the movie. It's revealed that her first name is actually Christine. Now, Ziggy, again, completely different from an 80s slasher movie. We're introduced to Ziggy as she's in an altercation with some other girls at the camp because she's been messing with their stuff. She cusses, she flips people off, she argues with the camp counselors, she kind of flirts with the camp counselor, practically makes out with them. She's a troublemaker through and through, very far from this Girl Scout bookworm that Carol Clover was talking about. And on top of that, we have the fact that Cindy Berman was a camp counselor, and Ziggy is a camp goer. She's a camper. In old Friday the 13th films, Halloween, whatever it may be, the campers were served no purpose as to get slashed at some point throughout the film. The camp counselors were the focus, their stories were important, and the final girl was the best of them. We have a complete switch of that. Ziggy is the troublesome camper that ends up surviving the film due to sheer determination. In all of these movies and in Final Girls now all over the place, we're seeing a very clear shift in what society feels is important for young women. When in the 80s we were valuing modesty, virginity, responsibility, now we have much more value in honesty, vulnerability. We value that the character is whoever they are unapologetically of their interests, their past, their history, their experiences. We're much more concerned with whether or not you are who you are and much less with how many people you've slept with. Next. The next movie I'm going to talk about is a revisitation of an OG 80s final girl. For this, I've picked Halloween from 2018. We're looking at Laurie Strode. Now, Laurie Strode in this movie, as you can see in the pictures, she's a grandma. There's no getting around it. There's no attempt to make her look like this hot 40-year-old looking grandma or to cast someone who's 45 to play an older Laurie Strode. We have Jamie Lee Curtis back in her prime, I think, with a beautiful gray wig, serving as a grandma Laurie Strode going against Michael. But her age is not the only way that Laurie has changed. The way that she behaves with and reacts to Michael Myers is also completely different. When in the 80s, Laurie was hiding, running away from Michael, now she's actually hunting him. We find her in this movie having been training ever since the first attack for when Michael returned. She has this doomsday prepper-like basement in her house. It has guns, it's got a remote control little door that she ends up using as a trap for Michael Myers so she can burn him alive. She's trained herself, her daughter, to shoot guns to defend themselves. She's estranged from her family and isolated as she's focused on being able to get revenge on Michael Myers. Completely different from the old Laurie. She says at one point that she's been praying every day that Michael Myers would escape from prison so that she could finally kill him. Nothing like old Laurie. On top of that, in their final fight scene, we have a beautiful turning of the tables. As instead of Laurie hiding in the closet as Michael stabs through, we have Laurie going room to room in her house looking for Michael, who's hiding from her somewhere in her house. This movie and it being so well received talked a lot about what our society has developed into. First of all, we were perfectly happy seeing our female character serve as the predator and not the prey in these films. Jamie Lee Curtis had all the power, was looking after Michael, even though he was frightening and intimidating and this looming nightmare figure. Laurie wasn't scared. She never cowered. She never was frightened. She never ran away from him. She was constantly in pursuit of Michael Myers so that she could take him down. And on top of that, it shows that we were comfortable with what I'm calling a final woman. Before this, a lot of reboots were being done of 80s movies where we just have a new group of teenagers fighting the same monster but in a modern setting. This was one of the first where they took an original final girl, brought her into modern times, and had this new revisit there. And everybody loved it. This movie paved the way for Texas Chainsaw Massacre to do the same thing, for Scream to do the same thing, because it showed that we were not just comfortable but more than happy to accept an older, more mature woman serving as our final girl heroine. She didn't have to be a 17-year-old hot high schooler. Next. Now, up until this point, I've mainly talked about movies that support my argument that final girls develop and are reflected, and I've shown how we've developed. But now I'd like to point back to two movies that were made within the time frame of Carol Clover's studies to show that there are contradictory examples. Horror movie critic Janet Steiger has talked about Carol Clover's summer synopsis and has discussed in great length that her sample size is too small, that she only picks very popular mainstream slasher movies, and she talks about 2 or 3 Texas Chainsaw movies, staying within a series. She doesn't get a very wide scale of slasher movies and what exactly they can look like. The first movie I'm going to talk about is Black Christmas. This movie came out in 1974, the same year as Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. It is one of the very first slasher movies to come out. Our final girl in this movie is Jess Bradford. Now this film is focused on a sorority house in Canada, a very progressive sorority house at that. And this movie really just contradicts everything Carol Clover has to say, formula-wise, about a slasher film. First of all, our virgin character, the character that they, Claire, who they call a professional virgin, is killed off first in the very beginning of the movie and serves as one of the only sorority house members killed for the most of it. The token promiscuous friend, I'll call her, who's very sexually liberal and makes a lot of dirty jokes and innuendos, lives until the last 30 minutes. I mean, there's a complete flip of who dies first and what earns you a death sentence in these movies. But most importantly is our final girl and how different she is. Jess Bradford is a college student, already making her too old to be a final girl. On top of that, Jess Bradford is pregnant. This picture you see in the end is her conversation with her boyfriend, where she tells him, "Hey, I'm pregnant, I don't want it." He freaks out, slams his piano. "You didn't even ask me, what are you talking about?" She responds with, "I wasn't even going to tell you. There's nothing to discuss. I won't change my mind." Jess Bradford stomps out. They argue about this several times. He goes on to threaten her. He's understood to be the suspected killer. Now, this killer in question, which is super great, he is called the Moaner. Now, in the sorority house, they have been getting these harassing phone calls of this man grunting, saying these obscene phrases over the phone. They spend the majority of the movie looking for him, not knowing that he's sitting in their attic next to their dead virgin friend. Now, all throughout this movie, Jess serves as a kind of opposite of the final girls we see in a Carol Clover movie. She is outspoken, she's kind, she's completely knit in her group. There is no set apartness about Jess. She's right there involved in her community. They're all very close friends. I mean, let's talk about it. Jess is pregnant, she's gonna get an abortion, she kills the wrong guy, all in one movie. I mean, she's incredible, and she lives, and typically she wouldn't have, but she does in this movie, and it is very contradictory to everything Clover has to say. But it's not just the final girl that's different. The movie in itself, the formula is very different. In this movie, Claire's boyfriend, who finds out his girlfriend is missing, is incredibly helpful. And in horror movies, the boyfriends tend to be kind of stupid, and he's not in this movie. Originally, the girls call their local police station, and there's commentary about this within the film. They don't take the girls seriously. Oh, Claire's probably with her boyfriend, that guy that's calling you, get over it, he's nothing serious. Well, Claire's boyfriend gets pissed. He goes to the man that they call lieutenant at the police station, says, "Get on it, this is ridiculous, my girlfriend's dead somewhere." And they do. And the police force are very helpful. Again, that doesn't happen in slasher movies. They do nothing in an 80s slasher film but show up too late and miss every shot they take. In this movie, they're great. They immediately have a search party that searches everywhere. They have people go from house to house looking for Claire. They even have a car parked outside with a police officer in it, which doesn't do much good because the motor kills them off kind of quick, but it's the thought that counts. They also tap the phones and are able to figure out the calls are coming from inside the house. And as soon as they figure that out, they rush there to save her. The entire movie, from aside from the fact that it's young people, they get killed off in these very dramatic, gory ways, it's very different from Carol Clover's slasher, and it's one of the most iconic. So to leave it out entirely is kind of bizarre. Now, another interesting fact, I didn't know this when I first picked this out, Black Christmas is actually a Canadian movie. All of my sources that I cite are cited within my paper. I'm not just pulling stuff out of nowhere. But Canada has been voted the second most progressive country when it comes to social issues, considering abortion, gay marriage, human rights, civil rights. And I think it's very interesting to see that when we compare a 1970s movie from Canada to a 1970s slasher movie from America, their values are very different. I think it does nothing but support the idea that our cultures and our values heavily influence our horror movies and our final girls within them. Now, the second movie I'm going to talk about is Alien with Ellen Ripley. Even people who don't like horror movies have seen Alien, have heard of Alien, probably love Alien. And Ellen Ripley is fantastic. Clover actually mentions Ellen Ripley, which I thought was interesting, because Alien's not always understood to be a slasher. It's sometimes called a sci-fi movie, a thriller movie, but it is a sci-fi slasher. They're getting killed off one by one in gory ways by some monster. It's fabulous. And she discusses Ellen Ripley, but only once, when saying that she's referred to by her masculine surname, which supports the idea that Ellen Ripley is actually a dude. How are they going to know she's a woman if they can't see her? Ellen Ripley is, again, a very contradictory figure. When we're first introduced to Ellen Ripley, she's having a conversation with her other female colleague on this spaceship about equal pay, saying, oh, we never get paid as much as they do. Already, we have a female character that's advocating for gender equality, which, you know, I love Laurie Strode, but in the 80s, she would have had no business talking about. Ellen Ripley, on top of that, her sexuality is never mentioned. She is sexualized, but compared to other final girls in the 80s, it's kept to a minimum. It's really in the one last scene with the alien kind of creeping. It's never discussed anything, whether she's a virgin, sexually active, whether she's married, whether she's single. There's no conversations about Ellen Ripley as a sexual being, or even as a moral being. I mean, she kind of is in discussions of being very upright. She follows the rules when it comes to the ship in quarantine. But other than that, Ellen Ripley is just another smart, capable member of her crew. She's respected, she's taken seriously. There is no timidness to Ellen Ripley. She stands by her ground, she is assertive, she is she advocates for whatever she thinks they should do and then does it. She's completely unemotional. There's no issue with, when her friends die, it's fine, she's just gonna get with it, aside from the cat that she protects the entirety of the movie somehow. Ellen Ripley just serves as a completer. She advocates for gender equality. She's in no way discussed as a sexual being. Her morality isn't really discussed. Every character in the movie is equal. There's no real character that's necessarily set up over talks about final girls being. And again, much like Jay Height in It Follows, Ellen Ripley goes through no real transformation, but it's unlike Jay, who stays in kind of the scared state. Ellen Ripley stays in the dominating state the entire movie. She never cowers, she never gets scared. She's cool, calm, collected the entire time. Even in that final scene, as lights are flashing, sirens are blaring, all of her friends are dead, this alien's lurking somewhere with this tiny little mouth, she's still super calm. I tried finding quotes of Ellen Ripley's in this fight scene, and there's barely any. She barely even talks, just calmly like walking through these foggy tunnels trying to make her way to this escape pod to get off of the ship. She's an incredibly empowering character, and to think that she's anything different is a very upsetting thing to say. So now I want to talk about why this is important. Why are we even talking about final girls? Well, in Carol Clover's paper, she makes the claim that to look at a final girl and see her as a feminist icon is a particularly grotesque form of wishful thinking. I think that's a grotesque form of ridiculousness. Final girls are beloved in the horror community. Final girls are some of the most popular female trope characters in movies in general. They have books written about them. There's clubs that are dedicated to them. There's more merchandise made and themed as a final girl than anyone could afford. There was even a movie in 2015 made called The Final Girls that gets a little bit meta about the idea. But nonetheless, final girls are loved. They are respected. The 80s girls like Laurie Strode and Nancy are revered as the OGs. New final girls are accepted and praised with every single horror movie. They're a huge part of my life, of a lot of the women that I know in the horror community. They are absolutely empowering figures, and it's important when we see their original discussion be so misogynistic and degrading, be revered in the way that it is. Carol Clover is referenced in any article you look up about a final girl. Anyone who talks about them goes, oh yeah, the Final Girls, which was titled by Carol Clover. She's great, but her understanding of final girls is nothing like what we understand a final girl to be now, but she's still held as the default. You want to know what a final girl is, go ask Carol Clover. And I don't think that's the way it needs to be, especially when it's so contradictory to the way we feel and write about final girls now. And even the demographic of the audience has changed since Clover's time. Now it's been seen that women make almost half of horror movie audiences everywhere. Obviously, the marketing to get women into the horror genre worked with those old 80s slasher films, because they're coming up in droves now to horror movies everywhere. More so, as I've shown through this, and my point with this is that final girls are reflective. They are empowering. As we develop, final girls develop. As women, final girls become more empowered. As women in society become more empowered. Final girls become more inclusive as media becomes more inclusive. They develop with us, they grow with us, they love us. Because of that, I think it's time that we need to redefine them. They need to be recharacterized in a way that's more accurate to who they are and what we believe them to be. Now, before I get into my new definition, I want to preface something. Obviously, when I talked about my final girls, my 3 new ones, including, and my reimagining, as I talk about final girls being empowering and representative, I showed you 3 straight white characters. But I want to make a point that that is not all we have now. As we are developing, the representation in final girls is growing. We have characters that are disabled, who are deaf, who are people of color, who are members of the LGBTQ+ community. It's not nearly as much representation as everybody deserves, but we are growing. That's just, unfortunately, the films that a lot of those characters are in don't classify as a slasher movie, so I didn't feel that they were as relevant to study in this project. But I want to showcase that we're not just developing in one way, we're developing all over when it comes to final girls in horror movies. So now we get to the new definition, their new characterization. Final girls are, a final girl is a woman who experiences extreme trauma. She faces death head on. She processes her trauma. She finds the power within herself to overcome that. She outsmarts her friends, everyone around her, while still being humble enough to accept help, whether it's through desensitization, self-actualization, or just determination. The final girl somehow is able to face these this awful adversity, these traumatic events, and find the power within her to save the day, save herself, and save anyone else involved. The final girl is a character who empowers herself not only on her own, but through the help of others, through her friends, through her family, through her spirituality, whatever it may be. The final girl is empowering herself. She doesn't have to be empowered. She doesn't have to pick up a chainsaw and be phallicized to be empowered. The final girl processes things, grows, develops in the span of an hour and a half to 2 hours, and it becomes an empowering character on her own. They only grow more empowering and inclusive as we advance and develop in society. They are impactful, empowering female characters who reflect the very women that they inspire. Thank you. Any questions? questions. Mr. Williams.
Yes, you and I talked many times about our fanhood of horror movies over the last year or so. My favorite 80s slasher movie franchise is the Evil Dead franchise, which has no final girl in it. But I want to get your opinion because they remade the first Evil Dead movie in 2013 and added a final girl to it.
I actually love it. I almost talked about it. My uncle back there wearing a Halloween shirt. He's also been my kind of slash my movie picker with me. And I almost picked Evil Dead. The only reason I didn't was because it also is kind of a possession film.
Yes.
And when I
it's
end
got
up
a lot
writing,
of slasher, one person dying after another.
Exactly.
Yes.
When I write my book in retaliation against Carol Clover's book, I'll discuss. She has an entire chapter that talks about possession, and that was a movie that I felt was applicable to talking about that. I love the new Evil Dead, and I think she's an iconic final girl. But more than that, in my research about final girls, I focus simply on women in final girl world. But I've read a lot and I've studied a lot on how even, when you talk about a final girl, that trope of being the last survivor that faces everybody dying, being very scared, but then getting over it and facing it, is not exclusive to female characters in horror movies. We have Ash Williams from Evil Dead. We have, can't remember his name. We have the final guy from Nightmare on Elm Street 2. We have these male characters that look and behave in the same way that a final girl does, and when we look at a society that is now obviously there's conversations all the time about it where we have people who don't even necessarily identify with being called a man or a woman. You also have to kind of face this conversation of, okay, do we need to change the title altogether to be the final victim, the final survivor? There's a lot that has to do with changing kind of how we view and define a final girl to include the male characters that look like that, or non-binary people that look like that, or characters that look like that. For the purpose of this and my very real heart and soul, I decided mainly just to focus on the women in these movies and why Carol Clover's so wrong about them. Yes.
So a couple of questions. First, do you think, I was actually going to ask that, you answered it well. I was going to bring up like the final guy trope, which is also maybe not as strong as the final girl.
It's not as common.
No, right, but if you see that they function differently, right? So like the Ash from Evil Dead, or the character from Get Out, or Final Destination, that kind of.
I don't think they necessarily do. They might look different. Carol talks in her book, and I do love what she has to say. She talks about how final girls, it has to be a final girl because these emotions of fear, trembling, whatever, are things that maybe an audience wouldn't feel comfortable seeing a male character feel or behave like in a movie. I don't think that makes a final girl a boy character, but it is an interesting thing to say. But watching Final Destination and Evil Dead, I do think that they behave the way. Ash nearly loses his mind in the second movie. I mean, he practically does. He's terrified, he chops his hand off. He goes through a full destruction of his psyche before he comes back and becomes who we know and love him to be, is overcoming these deadites. When you talk about Final Destination, he's terrified half the film with his visions.
Get Out's the same way. Get Out.
Yeah, he's terrified. I do think that it looks, as far as their transformation is similar, I still don't think they look the same, especially in the sense of the fact that when you talk about the way they're filmed, especially with women who are facing violence in a horror film, oftentimes there are moments where that is sexualized or it's made to be this beautiful kind of thing that's happening. Sometimes feminine pain in these horror movies is shot in a different way and then received in a different way from, Ash as he freaks out and has to cut his hand off, or it looks different, but I still don't think they're two separate things.
Okay, so another one. Thank you. That was good. And I want to get away from that stuff. So, is it wrong to read these classic horror films? Maybe not. Maybe it would be for the modern one because it seems like they're making a different point, even though they're using the same kind of tropes. But would it be wrong to read those older films in ways that don't acknowledge the gender or the sexuality of the individual. In other words, what I'm thinking is that a lot of times when I engage these films, I think of the characters as a moral character. Because it's essentially this kind of dichotomy between the good and the bad, the virtuous and the not. The slasher is clearly not good, and the person that they're trying to kill is either good or becomes good, right, and defeats the evil. Is it wrong to read it that way? Do we need to include the sexuality and all that stuff of it?
I think there's a lot to that question. Personally, I don't either. I believe that human beings in general, women in these movies, humans, period, we're complex beings. There's a lot to us, and to judge us based on one facet of our personality, I think slights everybody in a certain way. So I don't approach characters in a sense of, okay, let's talk about Adelaide. Is she, oh, but she's a virgin, you know, oh, what's she like? I talk about it a lot in this because often in the critiques of these movies and when people analyze these films, that is heavily a part of the analyzing of these characters. What are they like? Why is it important? And because of kind of the awareness of that formula, not so much that it is important that these characters are virgins or because they're morally just or whatever it is, but the fact that as we see in Scream, that was a very clear formula. I think the fact that that was upheld in the way that it was understood, this is why they're living, that's kind of how it was talked about. That was kind of why I felt it was important to discuss that we're outside of that way of thinking now, because I still do think that whatever we give the final girl or a final survivor or whatever, because like you're talking about, that good or evil, well, what we might perceive in society as the epitome of a good character is changing over time. That might look different as we develop and our opinions on things develop. I mean, if you look a long time ago, we would have great movie characters that were plantation owners with tons of slaves, and he was the good guy in a movie. We wouldn't do that now, and I think our understanding changes, so it is important to kind of look at that when we're, especially in this project when I'm trying to view them as the way that they reflect society. But I agree that when you're looking at a character or person in the world, that's not the most important thing about somebody, and you don't have to go about it focusing on that. I mean, this is a character, they're serving as the antithesis to our slasher, and here's what they do. I don't think it's wrong, but I think it's still important to look at it. Especially where, I think especially when we're looking at female characters where the sexuality oftentimes is so important, you'll see a female character be, kind of her character becomes destroyed throughout a movie, or audience members won't like her because she's this, very promiscuous character. Oh, she was just outspoken. She was, a B word, whatever. I think that when we're talking about women, it is kind of important to look at those things because it tells you a lot about the people making that movie, about the way audiences think, based on the way they receive those characters.
Yeah, it seems like the way that they have changed from Scream. Scream seems to be this kind of paradigmatic shift, right? Because the comedy of setting the rules and then breaking them intentionally, right, in the film, which is brilliant. But doing that does seem to kind of shift that so that you change the kind of way that we see these characters so that it becomes more important. It's not just it's not just a marker feature of their virtue, it's something else, right?
No, Carol Clover actually talks about that in her preface or foreword. She discusses how maybe the fact that she did line out so specifically what a final girl is, it's ruined that character now because everybody's now trying to do something different. And so by overanalyzing them but I think that's part of my argument with Carol Clover, is that everything's in this very clear box for her. These female characters act this way, these male characters act this way, final girls act this way. And she talks about the fact that when you define it so strictly and you go, this is what that is, then people are more inclined to go, oh really? Let me show you this instead. So it definitely happens.
I'll ask another one if nobody has questions.
Last question.
So it's actually an observation. So you had talked about how on Alien, there was that the sex isn't really there as much. It's there, it's just very symbolized. So
Well, yeah.
the alien
Not in
itself
terms of her
is very
character.
masculine.
Well,
Kind of
well,
thing,
but
chasing
also
her.
not. The alien also serves as kind of this mother figure. I read about that as well, gender in aliens. You see how almost all, when I talk about sexuality not being talked about, I mean that in terms of Ripley, like it determining who she is or how we interpret
Right.
her. But no, an alien, almost all of the people on that ship almost take an androgynous form. None of them really, I mean, they all dress very similar. It strips away very real, oh, Ripley's very feminine, or this is very masculine. And then they're all, frankly, able to be impregnated by the alien, which is like a super big moment. So the alien really takes on this feminine, this dominating feminine role over these androgynous figures throughout the movie.
But the design is very, I'm talking about the design.
Are we
I mean,
talking
it's
about the
very
tunnels and things?
Visually, well,
Clover talks about this stuff.
just the look of
It's hard for
that,
me.
just the look of the alien itself
Yeah.
is very,
Yeah.
right.
There's sexual undertones in pretty much every horror movie I have found, especially when Clover is talking about it. That is a very valid point. I mean, as far as sexuality existing in aliens and there being messages around that, but it wasn't something that determined who Ripley was or was super telling of her character.
Right, very well.
And if I could write a book on all of these movies, I would, and it would include all of that, I'm sure. But yeah, I pick and choose.
Not if, but when.
When.
All right. Well, thank you, Jenny.